these people are going to have a case of whiplash.
Oh, yeah, and I'm sorry for that, but, the funny thing is that when you've been raised and weaned on a steady diet of misinformation, disinformation, and lies, don't be surprised that when the truth comes along, it's going to taste funny at first.
Right.
So anyway, with that, I am very pleased to be able to have, as a return guest, Nila Sagadevan. I keep on doing that. It's a tough one. That's an odd pronunciation. But he has been a pilot of many years.
I think you did. We'll ask him what his name is. I like the way he pronounces it.
I think I got it right. But anyway, Nila, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hello.
There we go.
Welcome to the Power Hour, sir. I'm going to let you and Dave talk, but you really turned everybody upside down with what you had to say the last time you were on. We said, man, we got to get him back on, and soon. So thank you so much. But I'm going to let Dave take it over with you.
All right, Nila, and again, thank you so much for coming back. And I think I got that pronunciation. It's not an easy one to get, but anyway. First of all, why don't you tell us all what your background is? It's better coming, as they say, coming right straight from the horse's mouth here. So give us, how many years have you been involved, been an airline pilot, and what is your area of expertise?
Well, let me try and make this as brief as possible. I have a degree in aeronautical engineering, and I majored in aerodynamics. And I worked as a commercial pilot for a number of years. I've been in aviation for about well over 30 years now.
Okay, and 30 years. So you didn't exactly fall off of a turnip truck when it comes to this information that's been coming out about September 11th. Now, right off the bat, there's so many different things that we could discuss, but I was hoping that you might be able to give me, there's so many reasons why we shouldn't believe the official story of September 11th, but why don't we narrow it down? What would you say your top, say, 5 reasons are that we should be looking at the red flags?
Well, I'd like to start off with the Pentagon, because that's what originally piqued my curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
And allowed me to get into some deep research to find out what really transpired, because I was sent to a website, I believe it was called Freedom Underground or something, and when I watched a video clip there for about 45 seconds, I thought, this is impossible. I never realized that this is what had transpired, allegedly transpired. So I started looking at all the information that was available on the web and came to the conclusion that this was virtually impossible.
When you say this was virtually impossible, what was impossible, just to be clear?
For a number of reasons. First, I'll take it from an engineering perspective, and then I'll take it into the aspects of flying.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of aerodynamics, there's something called ground effect that I'm not sure how many people are familiar with. But you see, when an aircraft flares and descends the last few feet, coming to landing, for instance, the ground effect causes a pronounced increase in lift, and this can cause the aircraft to rise suddenly and quite significantly. This effect is commonly known as ballooning, and most people who've been in a commercial airliner, when you come into land, you sense that when you're floating over the runway, and there's a tendency for the airplane not to want to sink any lower because it's riding this cushion of air, if you will. And until the speed decays sufficiently, that cushion of air simply will not allow the airplane to come into contact with the ground.
So basically, as the plane moves through the air, it is obviously displacing air. There's air being pushed on top of the wing, and there's air being pushed underneath the wing. So what you're saying is that when you get close to the ground, the air being displaced has nowhere to go, so it pushes back, in other words, correct?
Yeah, precisely. It's somewhat analogous to a hovercraft, for instance. And hovercrafts, they trap a certain cushion of air under them, and that's what keeps them afloat.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, you can raise hundreds of thousands of pounds in this fashion.
So is it safe to assume that the faster that the plane is going, the greater the ground effect, or the greater the resistance is going to be for the plane to come in contact with the ground?
That's a very good question. Absolutely.
Okay.
Because the faster you go, the ground effect becomes so heavy. You simply cannot even push the plane down onto the ground if you wanted to. At the speeds this aircraft is, this so-called Boeing 757, which weighs 220,000 pounds, over 100 tons, doing 500 miles per hour approximately, and they claim about 10 feet above the ground, it would have been impossible. You see, it's not just a ground effect alone, because there's something called a sheet vortex, or a downwash that comes off the wings. And I don't want to get into deep aerodynamics, but you could say that the amount of downwash, the force exerted on the ground by the downwash, is exactly equal, the weight of the entire plane. In this case, let's say...
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. If you can imagine, say there's an imaginary weighing scale somewhere, an enormous weighing scale, and let's say this Boeing 757 flew over it, the scale would actually literally show you a weight of 100 tons. Because this is Newton's third law, which also comes in with Bernoulli's theorem and so forth about lift. To every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. For that plane to stay in the sky, there's 100 tons of lift being generated. Mm-hmm. And the downwash that comes off these wings is the equivalent of that. So it will actually exert 100 tons of downwash.
Wow!
This does not even take into consideration things like wingtip vortices, which are extremely violent. I mean, that's the reason you have the parallel runways you find at large airports have so much separation. And there are cases of actually large commercial aircraft flipping over, getting caught in one of these vortices.
Yeah, you can see that. I've seen that on movies, like when a plane is flying through a cloud or something like that. If you look at either end of the wing, you could see the swirling, like you said. It's like a whirlpool effect of the air that at the end of the wings. That's what you're talking about, right?
Absolutely. But these are extremely violent. I mean, there's so much aerodynamic energy in these vortices. They could flip trucks, huge trucks over buses. I mean, and here we have a 100-ton airliner coming on the deck at close to 500 miles per hour over I-35. The downwash and the wingtip vortices and the simple aerodynamic loading of this aircraft would have flipped trucks, cars, everything on that freeway. You would have had absolute bloody pandemonium as this airplane approached. It's impossible. It couldn't have come in at that altitude. We know it came in that low because it snapped a couple of lampposts on his way into the Pentagon. So it was about less than around 15 feet above the deck.
Oh, okay.
It's impossible to. There's no pilot on Earth, and I challenge anyone to come up on the air and tell me that they could do this. You simply cannot do it in a large commercial airline. Now, if you had a fighter aircraft with a very, very high wing loading, which these are designed to penetrate airspace at extremely low altitudes, now that's entirely possible. This is a Boeing 757. It's got a wingspan of 125 feet. It's impossible for this thing to have come in that low and this fast.
Now you bring up, before we shoot right by this, you brought up this issue about these lampposts being knocked over, and this is, of course, this is information and evidence that the powers that be and everybody else that doesn't believe that anything other than a 757 had hit the Pentagon, they relied very heavily on this. Now, what would be your explanation? What would have caused those light posts to have to fallen over like that? If it wasn't a 757, if it was not Flight 11, then what else could have caused those light posts to fall over or get knocked over or whatever?
Well, whatever knocked the light posts over obviously was an aerial vehicle. Now, the question is, what was it? Mm-hmm. And I think we can safely conclude it was not an airliner. It was not a Boeing 757. It was a very high-speed airplane with a very high wing loading. It was either a fighter or something. I believe it was a Global Hawk. It's a remotely piloted vehicle, even robotically piloted. This is the vehicle that actually took off from California all the way to Sydney and landed itself and applied its brakes all on its own, with absolutely no human intervention at all. Mm. So it was a very high-speed, highly wing-loaded airplane that came in at that altitude. Something else I didn't mention was jet blast. You know, I don't know how many people have tried to stand in the blast of a jet that is throttling up for takeoff or even for taxi. The energy that comes off of these engines, you're talking tens of thousands of pounds of static thrust. Mm-hmm. This thing could flip a truck over, literally. Literally, that's the reason. In fact, when I was a kid, about 14 years old, I tried to get close to a Boeing 707, cracked onto a runway just to stand up and see what it felt like. And I was in a little four-wheel tractor, and this thing flipped me and the tractor over several times. Wow. Just when it throttled up for takeoff. Now, imagine this 757 coming over I-35. You got its downwash, you got its wingtip vortices, you got a heavy downwash loading, and then you got a jet blast on top of this. You're looking at a degree of chaos that's unimaginable. This would be so utterly chaotic that you couldn't conceive of the sort of damage it would have caused.
Well, there are so many, and of course, when you factor in it, when you're talking about this ground effect at that speed, you're saying it would be impossible for a trained pilot to do it. We're not even talking about a trained pilot. We're talking about a pilot that supposedly had flunked out of flight school and flunked out flying something like a Cessna. I mean, a little putt in regard to airplanes is concerned. We're talking today with our special guest, Nila Sagadevan. Did I get it right?
Sagadevan.
Sagadevan. Okay, I'm so sorry. But anyway, we're going to take our break. Hey, bear with us, folks. It's been a long weekend and a long drive home yesterday, but I'm so glad. I'm fired up. I am thrilled to death to have Nila here. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Monday morning edition of the Power Hour. Coming up on 25 minutes past the hour, this is Dave and Joyce, and we're talking today about what else, folks? September 11th, the official story just doesn't wash. The facts, common sense, the evidence screams for answers to questions that the mainstream just does not want even asked. And we're talking today with Nila Sagadevan, who has been a pilot for 30 years, and knows what we're talking about. Now, before we went off to the break, we were just starting to touch upon this issue. Well, we talked about the light posts that were falling down. Now, you mentioned about a global hawk. Now, you believe at this point that it was something like a global hawk that would have been able to take out those light posts and created the damage at the Pentagon. Is that what you're saying?
Or a fighter, a very high-speed fighter. Mm-hmm. I've heard people speculate that it might have been an A3 or an A4 Skyhawk. So it was a high-speed, highly wing-loaded airplane, a very small one. Because the hole that was penetrated in the Pentagon, most people don't realize is the photographs that are shown constantly and the footage that is shown constantly on television is of a huge chunk of this, the facade of this one wing, the east wing of the Pentagon, having collapsed.
Right.
That is not true. For 33 minutes, that entire wing, the wall, withstood the impact and stood up, quite intact. And you could quite clearly see, if you do your research and find the photographs for those first of the wall during those first 33 minutes, you'd see that the entire hole that was made in this thing was just 14 to 16 feet in diameter. There is only one hole. It is impossible for a Boeing 707, whose engines, the RB211s, are located about 40 feet apart, span-wise. 6,000-pound engines, span-wise, 40 feet apart, doing 500 miles per hour. If a 757 hit that building, it would have taken out the entire east wing. I have absolutely no doubt. You're talking of billions of foot-pounds of kinetic energy.
Well, you know, there are folks out there that are just screaming the praises of the emperor's new clothes. I mean, they're talking about the filigree and the silk and the satin and the handiwork and all that. And we all know that the emperor is stark naked walking down the street. How do we deal with folks like this that simply will not use their heads when they look at the photographs and try to utilize common sense? It screams it's impossible that a 757 had done this, and then they're backed up with organizations like the American Society of Civil Engineers and their Building Performance Report in regard to the Pentagon. When you look at stuff like this, how does it make you feel? How do you deal with these people?
Dave, it's very, very frustrating. You know, there's a tremendous amount of psychological inertia involved in this. There is an innate reluctance on the part of the average person on the street to go into a state of abject denial. It's almost impossible for these people to accept the fact that the government has lied to them. Yeah, they've been lied to.
I can't help but think of a Jack Nicholson when he says, well, you can't handle the truth, you know. I think that's exactly where we are.